This is the Forward Thinking Podcast. I'm your host, Xander, Director of Marketing Operations at CS2. And joining me today is Director of Solutions Architecture at CS2, Nina Valtcheva. Nina, it's so great to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I know, I'm so excited. I've listened to probably every single episode at this point, so I'm excited to finally be featured on my own episode, talking about one of my favorite topics.
Long time overdue. This is definitely a passion of yours. I know I've learned a lot from you in my own data enrichment projects, so I think that our audience is definitely going to get a lot out of the topic today. The topic today is data enrichment strategies and really like how to operationalize this. Data enrichment obviously being a really critical part of your operations strategy and your go-to-market strategy. And I feel like everybody does it a little bit different. And I feel like it can also cause a lot of unintended damage to your database. So having the right strategy up front is really important.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. So before we jump right in, Nina, this is like the first time that you've been solo on the podcast, correct?
Yeah. I've been on the team episodes before, but this is my first solo one.
Well, welcome. Would love to just get a little bit of background from you for our audience. Tell us, how did you get involved in marketing operations? And then also, how did you get involved with CS2?
Yeah, so I've actually been in marketing operations pretty much from the beginning of my career. I happened to land a job at Cisco right after college doing mostly campaign operations. So stayed there for a few years and then moved on to a few different startups, including DataStax, where I got to own Marketo and all the MarTech tools. And then a few years later, joined CS2. I was actually a previous client at a company called Diamanti, and I loved working with the team so much. I jumped at the opportunity to join CS2, and I've been here for about 2 years.
That's incredible. Going from a client to a director in the
Hmm.
team, providing a ton of value to all of our clients. You're in a unique position that you don't have just one set of clients that you work with. You can work with all of ours because we all rely on you for a bunch of expertise that you have. How is that? Do you thrive in that type of environment?
Yeah, and it's definitely just a lot more learning than you would get in like a traditional in-house role. Like I always joke, like we're always even together, we're always working on a life cycle project together. Like I think
Yes.
I've built like 5 life cycles just in the past year, which in an in-house role, like maybe you'll do that once or twice in your career, but here you get to do a lot of projects and you evolve each time you do one. So it's a
And
lot of great learning.
Absolutely. We're always learning something new, even though we've done so many life cycle projects. Every time we do it, it's a little
Right.
bit different. It's a different approach, but so like it's still really engaging. I used to build life cycle projects a lot when I was in house because we kept on changing the way that we were going to go about going to market, and I was getting really annoyed with it because I was changing so much. Whereas here, they're always different clients, so I
Right.
actually stay really engaged even though it's like technically the same maybe project that we would think about. So,
Mhm.
well, good. Nina, thank you so much for sharing some of that, some of your background there. Speaking of that background, since data enrichment is one of your passions, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page. What is data enrichment, and what are some of the benefits to having a strong implementation and strategy around this?
Yeah. So data enrichment, typically you would define it as the process of enhancing first-party data, like what you already have in your existing database, which could be incomplete or outdated, and you then enhance it with additional third-party data in order to improve database health and completeness and accuracy, and get more data and information that can be used in segmentation, targeting, routing, among other things. Typically, we see data that gets enriched. It can be like at the company demographic level, so things like company address, employee size, revenue, industry, or the person level demographics, so things like person address, job title, job function, job level, phone number, email validation. Like there's so many, there's probably like hundreds of data points. And some vendors also provide behavior intent data, so pain points, researching certain topics, technologies used, things like that. And typically, the way that enrichment works is data is sent through an integration between your marketing automation platform and/or your CRM and the enrichment tools, such as some of the ones we work with are Zoom Info and Clearbit. And then the enriched data is synced back into those systems. So just a high level overview of how data enrichment actually works.
Found fantastic, and it's very foundational, right? Everybody
Right.
says data is king, and I
Mhm.
think every environment that we walk into, admittedly, even environments with a data enrichment platform, like you still have stale data.
Oh
It's
yeah.
such a difficult problem to solve for. Um, but having a trusted data vendor is key to making
Mhm.
that work, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Fantastic. So if I don't, we're going to spend the majority of today's podcast really talking about like going into some of the weeds on like how to do it right and what are some of the considerations. But for our audience who may be looking at this more from a strategic perspective, if I didn't have a data enrichment platform, do you have any suggestions on ways that I could help to build a business case to get a tool? Because one thing that I know is that a lot of these tools are pretty expensive in the grand scheme of your technical of your tech stack, because again, data is expensive. So, any suggestions or recommendations around that, Nina?
Yeah, that's always a tricky part, building a business case for it, especially if your leadership doesn't realize how important data is. But quality data really is the key to being able to segment your database effectively for sales and marketing. We will talk about measuring the effectiveness of enrichment later, but if you just have absolutely nothing today, there are a few data points that you can pull. So things I like to pull is just look at overall reach of your ICP accounts. Like, do you have the account data in your system necessary to build sales territories around and segment for marketing? Do you have field completeness of the key fields that you use for targeting and segmentation? Just review your most critical fields, see how accurate is the data, how many records are missing key data values. For example, if you have key personas that you're marketing to, audit the persona coverage and see if you're missing a large percentage because of a lack of job title, job function, job level that can be augmented by data enrichment. Or also, if you have a large percentage of your database that gets set to disqualified nurture, if you have disposition reasons that indicate bad data or unable to reach, look at what percentage are missing phone numbers or like are missing email addresses, because those are also data points that can be augmented by data enrichment. And I do also want to point out that some of these vendors also can be used for contact acquisition. Like you can just download basically like a bunch of prospects into your database, but we don't recommend using a data platform just to spam contacts and leads. It can be useful for identifying key personas within your target accounts, and just works well on other outbound tactics outside of email. So use it for paid media, social selling, things like that. But just don't spam cold data. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Absolutely, and I mean it's a big topic.
Mhm.
I know it. Every time that I speak with another MOPS manager, and their teams are doing it, like it's just that, like, oh, you kind of cringe
Mhm.
when you have that conversation. Both of us do. We're like, I don't want to do it, but
Yeah.
it is coming down the pipeline, so that's a whole different conversation.
Yes.
But it is a way that obviously you're trying to get that data after you have acquired them from actual inbound methods is
Mhm.
ideal. But if you wanted to supplement your social selling strategy or things like that, I think that it is a definitely an applicable use case.
Yeah.
um I know, like, when I'm having conversations around lead scoring or account scoring or things like that, which was just recently a topic. um you always have to start with, well, what does the database data tell us? If I
Mhm.
create a really rigid demographic score based upon job title and all of my job titles are not normalized, and
Right.
it's only 30% of my records that have it. Like, that will tell you whether or not that lead scoring project is going to be worthwhile investing all of
Correct.
that time,
Yeah.
or do you need to get the right data first, right?
Yeah, definitely. We've done a lot of implementations where, as part of like a lead scoring project, we also incorporate enrichment data, which can be so much helpful because it's just hard getting that data without an enrichment provider, unless you have like 20 forms, 20 fields on a form, which you always want to avoid.
And then you have no inbound leads because nobody
Yeah.
wants to fill out that form. The other piece that you had mentioned, just around the platform itself, is things like intent data or de-anonymizing your website. You can actually utilize these tools to reduce the number of form fills. So you can build your business case around not just the internal health of your database and like prioritizing that for segmentation and better targeting,
Mhm.
but you can also improve the customer buyer experience when they're filling out those forms. And if you can remove some of those fields that today you may be requesting of somebody, you can reduce some of those friction points, increasing conversion on your website, which I think is every marketer's goal from a digital perspective. So
Yeah,
there's
definitely.
definitely some areas there to hook into as well.
Mhm.
So, Nina, you have come up with a few different enrichment projects while here at CS2. I know that I've utilized a lot of your documentation and process. How would you recommend going about setting up a data enrichment tool in your CRM or marketing automation platform?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to think about. Just around the strategy and before you actually do the actual implementation. The first thing is deciding where to integrate, whether you do it through your marketing automation platform or Salesforce or both. For example, if you have Marketo and Salesforce, but the majority of leads are created first in Marketo and then synced over to Salesforce, you would typically want to set up the person level enrichment, like leads or, and contacts through Marketo, and then set up the company or account level enrichment through Salesforce. So just think about where the data first gets created, and then also think about when you need to enrich. Once a record is created, or do you want the data sooner, like when they're filling out a form? Since, as you mentioned, Xander, like there are some enrichment vendors that offer a form enrichment solution where you can reduce the number of fields on your forms by appending that data on the back end through enrichment, and then that leads to better form conversion.
That's
Um,
fantastic. So really being focused
mhm,
on the where and the what, right? What
correct.
type of information. You're not going to set up your marketing automation platform to update accounts because most of them are not
Right.
updating accounts, right?
Exactly.
So you still
Hmm.
need to have it in both of those systems. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
or you may make a decision to say I just want it in one or the other, but just understand that there are going to be limitations from a read write perspective and a order of ops perspective.
Hmm.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the second point I would think about before you set up is like deciding on which fields you actually want to create and enrich. Typically, an enrichment vendor offers dozens, if not even hundreds, of data points, and you probably won't need to use all of them. So ask the vendor if they can just send you a list of fields that are available to map over and enrich, and make sure you understand how you'll be charged. Typically, we've seen where it's like a credit per record enriched, regardless of how many data points you're actually enriching on that record. So go through the list of fields available to enrich and document which fields you actually want to sync over. Like maybe you don't care about syncing over the company founded year or how many Twitter followers that company has. So just something to think about of actually like what are the key fields that you do plan to use.
Do you recommend like looking at your existing number of fields? I know sometimes we'll
Right.
be with clients who are pretty much near their limit. So if you're going to add
Mhm.
50 fields for data enrichment, that may be a bad idea.
Yeah, that is always something to consider. Yeah, if you are running into field limits, especially on the Salesforce side, always think about that. But then also kind of weigh that against how useful would it be to actually have that data? Maybe if you are running into limits, just think about if there are fields, existing fields that you can actually deprecate in order to make room for these enrichment fields.
Yeah, that makes sense. And sometimes they have like custom objects, right? Where you can have more information maybe on their custom object, but you just prioritize the fields that you need to operationalize on a lead in contact.
Right, right.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. And then I always also like to document how each enrichment field will be used. Like if the data will be used to append to a standard field, make sure to document that. You can like ideally add it to a data dictionary that you already have, or at least list what fields are mapped for enrichment and how the data gets appended to your standard fields. And one tip I like to offer is also checking with the vendor if they have an email verification enrichment data point. And if they do, definitely take advantage and map over those fields, which are helpful in figuring out which email addresses in your database are valid versus invalid. And that way you can also avoid paying separately for an email verification tool if your enrichment vendor can already offer that.
Yeah, that's a great option, and I think one that people kind of forget about. But being able to utilize the third party tool doesn't impact your deliverability because you can basically use this tool to identify if it's bad emails, and they'll come back, they'll give you like it's good, it's not good, or we don't
Hmm.
know. And I always recommend, like, if it's not good and they can tell you that, great.
Yeah,
Those are the people that you can just immediately eliminate, and then just be careful with the ones that they don't know, because you don't know either.
yeah, it'll be really useful if you are doing database purges, just ones that are bounced for sure, and your email verification comes back and they're invalid. And once those are ones you can purge from your database potentially.
Absolutely. So would you suggest, like, you kind of mentioned reviewing the fields that are available to you. Do you generally recommend that you map into standard fields, or would you, if you had no constraints, would you always recommend that somebody create custom fields for this?
Yeah, unless you're running out of fields you can create, I recommend creating custom fields for all the enrichment data you'll be syncing over. Ideally, the data should be available in both your CRM and marketing automation platform. I've seen cases where originally you think you may only need to see the data in Marketo, but then maybe you implement lean data at a later point and decide you'd like to use the location enrichment data for lead routing, like but based it on the company country, but you don't have that data in Salesforce. It only lives in Marketo. So it's then more of a hassle to then create the field in Salesforce and map into the existing field from Marketo. I have to work with Marketo support to do that and get all the data corrected, which, yeah, is just a bigger hassle. So if you have Marketo in Salesforce, for example, create all the fields in Salesforce first, and then make sure the Marketo integration user can see them so they'll sync over. And one gotcha with Salesforce that I always like to mention for person level enrichment, you'll want to create the fields on both the lead and contact objects. And then don't forget to map the fields together in lead field mapping. We've seen cases where people like they get converted to a contact and then the data disappears, and it's because they haven't been mapped over and don't exist on the contact object. So you lose all that data if the lead gets converted to a contact. So always make sure the fields are created on both and mapped together. And another thing is always thinking about what objects you actually want to enrich, like whether only leads or contacts or also accounts. You may want to start out with just lead and contact enrichment, but if the vendor also allows for account enrichment, set that up too to get account level data, such as revenue size, industry, and employee range, if those are important data points for your company.
That's
Um,
fantastic. I was I still struggle a little bit of, like, is it worth having the custom, like a zoom info field or a clearbit specific field? Because then if the data mismatches, sometimes people get a little bit confused. Where's the, I know that you found value of having these in separate fields. Are there any like specific use cases that you've planned that around?
yeah, so yeah, usually we see there are two options, either create custom fields specific for the enrichment vendor, or map into the existing fields, which you already have. Um, and then one thing to keep in mind is how you map the data. So whether you set it to overwrite or complete if missing. So I always recommend creating vendor specific fields and then setting them up to get updated every time the record gets enriched because it gives you more control of the data. And it also helps to ensure you have the latest data, since typically with some enrichment vendors, the records you enrich will be what's called under management for a certain period of time, like a year. So you can enrich them multiple times to have the latest and most accurate data.
That makes
So
sense.
instead, like if you do choose to map to existing fields, like standard fields directly, you would typically set it up to only update the field with the enrichment data if it's currently empty, but that can be limiting since maybe you do want it to update if the current value is junk. So I
Yeah,
do like to create vendor specific fields and then set up automation in either the marketing automation platform or via Salesforce flows on how the data should then be appended to standard fields. And you can have much more control that way on when the data should be appended. For example, like I always like to point out for state, you can build automation and have criteria to only append the standard state field with the enrichment value if all the standard address fields are empty, or the country is empty, or country is United States or Canada, but state is empty. That way you can prevent mismatch scenarios, like if a lead already has, let's say, India for a value for country, but the state gets appended as New York through the enrichment, which things like that can happen. The complete address data would be mismatched. So having this additional criteria, which you can set up with more control through like your own automation, it can prevent this by only appending of the data if the country is United States or Canada, or if all the address fields are empty.
that's
Another
great.
example is like job title. Maybe you already have a value in the standard field, but it's junk or something like test or NA, not provided, unknown, none. So in that case, you can have automation to append the enrichment, append the job title with the enrichment job title instead, which will likely be a more accurate value than what you already have. So that's why I like vendor specific fields and then setting up automation in your own system. So you have more options this way, since the custom enrichment fields are always synced and then you decide how to use that data in your own systems.
Very cool. Yeah, and I mean, maybe there's certain processes where you just say, well, let's just use the zoom info field, and like
Yeah,
we'll keep the standard, but you have the option at that point.
right. Hmm.
And I've definitely seen value of having like being able to overwrite not applicable NA. Those are things
Hmm.
that you don't necessarily get a lot of control over within the data platforms themselves.
Right, yeah, because there you typically just get the option either append if empty or overwrite, which I know a lot of times it could be dangerous if you just overwrite it. So that's why, yeah, with this approach, you have more control over how the data actually does get appended.
Very cool. We know that data is expensive. Do you have any recommendations on things that you should do to kind of limit how many credits are being used if that's the way that the subscription model is built?
Yeah, definitely. You may want to create a suppression list of records that you don't want to enrich. Things like competitors, employees, people that are unsubscribed. So you just don't want to waste credits on records you'll never market to. So just don't send those through enrichment. And then also always be mindful of the order of operations and how you're using the enrichment data. For example, like if you have lead routing and it depends on address fields like territory, so things like country and state being populated for territory management, ensure there is enough time for the lead to get enriched, sync to Salesforce. Then then the data actually gets enriched and appended before you try to route them. So with lean data, for example, I like to have a hold until node that waits for the enrichment and the whole order of ops to be done processing before running them through the lead router. Another example is for opt-in, have a short wait step to allow for the lead to get enriched if it doesn't have country information. before running them through like any kind of opt-in automation you have.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Um, any other tips or advice on the build? I know I want to talk about monitoring and proving out the value of the tool next, but anything that we should discuss with the audience on the build itself?
Yeah, the build, I mean, I always like to document, make sure exactly uh, what fields are created and how they're mapped over, and how they're then appended to standard fields. Typically, like, and I've done the build both ways. Like, if you have Marketo, typically I would build there, build all the automation for how to actually append um, the enrichment data to your standard or existing fields, or you can also do it through Salesforce flows as well. Again, I think it mostly depends on where the data originally gets created first. So that's where you decide where to build this additional automation.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I know I've recently been working with a client who actually has multiple data vendors. What a fortunate place to be in. So like their Salesforce team uses one, and then their marketing team uses
Mm-hmm.
another, and then the question becomes like, well, which one should we use as a source of
Source of
truth or
truth,
things like
yeah.
that, right? And the answer is it depends, and
Right.
you have to have those conversations. Definitely don't solve a data enrichment project in a silo, because
Mm-hmm.
it impacts not just marketing, not just sales, but the whole go to market team. It could have impacts on customer success. It could have impacts on professional services. So make sure that you're getting all of the inputs from the various teams to make sure that you are, identifying the right vendor if you don't have one, or utilizing the right vendor if you do, and perhaps you have multiple. Because nothing's worse than routing somebody based upon data vendor one, and then data vendor two has completely different information. And then the
Mm-hmm.
sales team comes knocking on the door saying, hey, why is my lead routing broken? I went out to this data vendor and it says it's in my territory.
Mm-hmm.
Can definitely cause more trouble than it's worth. Spoken from
Yeah,
some
exactly.
experience.
And then it kind of just creates like messiness where you maybe you don't even know where the data is coming from. Like if you do directly append it to standard fields, like and that gets created that way, you might not know that it's coming from this vendor versus then it tries to get enriched by this other vendor. So always have a clear process and that's documented of exactly how the data gets appended.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I don't think that we talked through this use case either, but the other reason why I like having separate fields and having the automation rules built accordingly is like sometimes the salesperson has different information than a vendor has.
Mm-hmm.
Title recently changed, vendor's out of
Right.
date, they update the title. Next week they come back, the title's been overwritten by the data vendor, and now you're going, well, I want it to be accurate. They got a promotion. They're now in my target account list or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
You want to have that flexibility for sure.
Exactly.
So, when it comes to monitoring, what recommendation do you have to keep an eye on this and then also prove out its effectiveness?
Yeah, like definitely make sure you don't just set it and forget it. Like make sure you continuously do monitor enrichment. I like to create a database health dashboard in Salesforce and have components that look at enrichment status. So like how many records were enriched, how many were not matched, how many were only company level enriched versus person level enriched. If there were any enrichment errors, things that you need to troubleshoot. Typically, the vendor would have like some sort of field like enrichment status that indicates the outcome of like what the actual like if they were enriched and then how they were enriched. And also, I like to look at field completeness in your key fields that you use for segmentation and routing, things like that, to see if it improves over time now that you have enrichment. And another thing I do want to point out is like how to like usually I like to set up both instant and scheduled enrichment when possible. So instant is when a record is first created, you would send it through enrichment, or it can get enriched through the form, and that can be done as part of a master order of operations program. But there are always cases I've seen where enrichment might fail, like the webhook could be throwing an error or just unavailable. So I also like to set up batch enrichment, where in case any records were not enriched, which you would typically identify by that enrichment status field, you can send them through on a nightly or weekly batch again to try enriching those that were missed. And that's where having a dashboard where you look at your enrichment results will be helpful to know, like if there are a lot of like a large percentage that aren't getting enriched for a certain reason, and then you can look into that.
Yeah, very helpful. Every project should end with a report and a dashboard, and
Mhm.
sometimes the easiest reports and dashboards to make sure that you have built are the things that you are monitoring now on a weekly basis or what have you. And the more that you can build automation to just constantly fix that, so it doesn't have to be a
Yes,
manual push, the better.
exactly.
Fantastic. So that's from like a data cleanliness perspective. What about from like if I'm trying to prove out the value of this investment that we made as an organization? What do you recommend that we report on there?
Yeah, so for measuring enrichment impact, like especially if it's before you're actually implementing enrichment, I like to create a snapshot of the database and key fields pre-enrichment to see the percent of data completeness. And then once you have enrichment on for a few months, take a snapshot after the data has been enriched. So and then if you're not enriching the entire database, then pick a time frame, like usually like say between 1 and 3 months, and then take a snapshot of records created after the enrichment has been live for that time frame to see if the percent of data completeness is improved. And you can also use the enrichment status field to compare if leads that have been enriched have a higher conversion rate than those who have not been enriched. Another thing I always like to do is create like an actual data quality dashboard and score functionality. There's actually a Salesforce trailhead on that that we can link to for this podcast, but that's also something that is useful for measuring like once you do have enrichment, like is the data quality actually improving? And then if you have tools like Outreach or SalesLoft, you can look at connection rate to see if it has improved over time because of having more phone numbers. And then for email, you can look at email response rates, especially for segmented nurture emails, to see if those that were enriched versus not enriched had a higher response rate.
I like that. So it's not just about database health, it's about like what are
Hmm.
the actual results that we are seeing.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, if you are incorporating some of this data in like an account scoring methodology, you can also take a look at do you have an increased conversion rate of accounts? If you're
Yeah.
utilizing it as a part of your lead scoring, you can identify
Hmm.
is my conversion rate from sales ready to opportunity improved?
Hmm.
Are we getting more volume because we're actually identifying people before they're engaging with forms or anything like that? There's definitely some areas there to hook into.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit harder because you need more foundation pieces built up. You
Hmm.
need an account scoring methodology or what have you, but definitely some things to investigate and think about and add to your roadmap if you have them.
Yes.
We always love to talk about kind of the gotchas and what you shouldn't do.
Hmm.
And these may be things that people are currently doing, and that's a-okay. We've all been there. We've all, either inherited an instance or made a decision based upon the facts that we had at the time. But any recommendations on things to avoid when it comes to data
Yeah,
management?
yeah. These are always fun, but or I've seen cases where a company already has an enrichment vendor, but then a certain team is not aware of it, so then they go and purchase another vendor. And then to make it worse, both are mapping to standard fields instead of creating custom fields, which makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to figure out where the data is coming from and what the source of truth is. And it could introduce racing conditions. So always evaluate whether you actually have a solution that does enrichment and whether you do need to introduce a new tool.
Yeah, yeah. Again, don't develop this in a silo by any means. And maybe you
Mhm.
don't have a tool, but maybe there's two teams looking at getting a tool at the same time
Mhm.
and you don't know, and then all of a sudden you both start to implement at the same time, which I've seen happen, and it can have the same detrimental effects for sure.
Yeah, or even like when you are evaluating a tool, just basing it on, oh yeah, somebody used it at this last company. Always do your diligence and make sure you evaluate multiple vendors. You can typically, what I like to do is send them, like have them do a data bake off. So send them some data and see like how they enrich it and see which one does better. So always do your due diligence if you are evaluating multiple vendors.
That's great. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the if the data is being populated. It, I think when you talk about that bake off, like I ask for the details. I want to know,
Mhm.
hey, this is only 1,000 records that I'm asking for.
Yeah.
Give me the information, because sometimes they'll tell you that we enriched it because we found their first name and last name, and you're like, well, their email address was first dot last. Like you're not doing any rocket science
Right.
here, right?
Yeah.
But you're calling it an enriched record. Like, I really want to know, do you have direct dials? Do you have job titles? Do you have number of employees? And are they accurate?
Yeah, exactly.
For
Yeah.
sure.
It's always a fun exercise.
Yes, and sometimes it can be time consuming, but it's time well spent,
Yes,
because
definitely.
you are going to be in a contract for 1 or more years. So if you make a
Mhm.
mistake on that on the front end, it's not great.
Yeah. Another thing is making sure you're not enriching the same records through both the integration with Salesforce and your marketing automation platform, which I've also seen, because you can use up wasting credits that way or inserting racing conditions, especially if your enrichment settings, like in the integration tool, like what fields do you enrich or map differently in the Salesforce versus marketing automation platform settings. So that's always a danger because there's different places where you can actually like say what data points you're mapping over in Salesforce versus marketing automation. So make sure the like you're like if you are doing lead and contact enrichment, typically you would do that through marketing automation through that integration, and then like do account enrichment through Salesforce.
And do you think that there's a difference there, like between instant versus scheduled? Like I've built it in the past where I'll do a webhook in my marketing automation platform, call out to one of the data vendors, and then I'll do the monthly refresh on a
Mm-hmm.
out of Salesforce, just so that way we're not using more webhook calls than we need to on the automation side. What do you think there?
Yeah, that's how I like to do it too. Like the instant, just yeah, do it. Use the webhook, but then there are always cases where you do want to do a batch, and that can be done. I like to actually do it on a weekly basis, like over like like on a Saturday or something. Then that can yeah, like you can easily set it up to go through Salesforce as well. Since those records are already created, you don't need to use that data right away,
Yeah,
potentially.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
cool.
and
Okay.
I do like my last point there is as far as what things not to do is don't just turn it on and forget it, as already mentioned. Like there are always issues that could arise, and you should have monitoring reports that you look at ideally on a weekly basis to make sure the data is actually getting enriched. And if it isn't, know when to troubleshoot what the issue is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's easy to, we're moving on to the next project. We just got done talking about the
Mm-hmm.
product methodology that we have at CS2. And I
Yeah.
think that it's really key that, we're in a continual monitoring perspective when we are
Mm-hmm.
implementing these new tools and technologies, for sure.
Definitely.
Any closing thoughts for the audience, Nina?
Yeah, so I do want to say enrichment can be very powerful and deliver a lot of data points that you wouldn't get otherwise, but there is a lot to think about when deciding how to implement it. So make sure you have a strategy in place, or if you're inheriting an existing enrichment solution, audit to see how the data is coming in and how it's used, since there may be ways to optimize.
For sure. Yes. What a great way to end a pretty weedy, in the weeds type of podcast that we have
That's how
here.
I like to be. I always like to get into the weeds.
I think our listeners definitely appreciate that. We like to live there as well. I know you and I were chatting up earlier this week, prepping for today's podcast, and you're like, I don't know, it might be too detailed. I'm like, let's do
Yeah.
it, let's go for it. So I really do hope that it was something that folks are going to be able to take with them. It's a great This is a great topic and a great podcast kind of outlining some of the specifics. So if you already have a platform in place, maybe it's time to add it to your roadmap to revisit. If you're not actively monitoring your enrichment platform, now's the time to start. And if you don't
Hmm.
have a data platform and you're wondering, is now the time for us to get it? I mean, as Nina and I said, it's the foundation of your automation. It's the foundation of your segmentation. So definitely worthwhile building out the business case for it.
Yes.
Nina, thank you so much for joining us today and walking through this process, and giving some really great recommendations. I appreciate your time.
Yes. Thanks, Andrew. It was a fun chat. Thank you.
Absolutely. Looking forward to having you on next. You've been listening to the Forward Thinking Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would really appreciate it if you could go out and give us a review. This helps us get this message in front of more people. Share it with a colleague, share it with a friend. I don't know if you'd want to share this one with your parents who don't know anything about operations, but just in case if they have some extra time and they want to listen a little bit about data enrichment, please do share that. I'm Xander Broffel. I was joined today by Nina. Thank you and have a